Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves in Tweed, and here I talk about all things tea. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, be sure to subscribe to follow more of what I do. This week, we're still in Russia, but instead of looking at 18th century tea, we're going to be looking at 20th century history. So today, we're having tea in Soviet Russia. So one of the things I love about history is that it is a continuum. It's not just what happened 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. It also includes more recent history. So today I thought it would be interesting to follow up last week's video about Catherine the Great with a little bit more about more recent tea history. So one of my friends is a food historian. I've consulted with him on a couple of different blog posts and videos that I've done, and he's just fascinating to chat with about the history, but he also grew up in Soviet Russia. So I was able to chat with him about how he remembers the tea growing up in Russia with his family. And he had some fantastic vivid memories of tea at home, tea out in public, even tea at school, that were just amazing to hear about. And I was able to put together a tea session inspired by his memories to talk a little bit about tea in Soviet Russia and in the Soviet Union. So one of the things that is very well known about Russian tea is that it is brewed strong as a concentrate and then diluted with hot water. It's actually very similar to the Turkish method of brewing and serving tea. And interestingly enough, my friend said that his grandmother always drank her tea out of a Turkish tea glass. So that is what I am using today. I'm using one of my Turkish tea glasses, which I thought was very interesting that I actually had the right kind of glass for part of this, because I don't have a tea glass with a holder like became very popular in the Soviet Union. So tea in Russia actually became popular among most of the population in the 19th century. But in the early and mid 20th century, tea cultivation began on an industrial basis, on a large-scale basis, in what is now the country of Georgia, which was controlled by the Soviet government back then. And while the tea production in Georgia eventually faltered, it has recently been revived. And I found it really interesting that I actually have some Georgian tea to have tea as my friend would have enjoyed it with his family in Russia before shortages started in the late 80s. So I've brewed my tea concentrate. This is a couple tablespoons of loose leaf tea. He did specify almost everybody he knew drank loose leaf tea except for one person who was a very busy dentist. So loose leaf tea, brewed strong. This has been brewing for probably about a half an hour at this point. You just put the tea in the pot and fill it with hot water and go about your day, and you can refresh it as you go. One of the things I found really interesting was he talked about how when he was at school, there was always one student whose duty it was for the day to go and fetch the pot of tea. And that just reminded me of the students in my school in the US who would go and fetch the milk. So we'll pour our tea concentrate in. And that is very dark. I like my tea strong. And then I have a flask of hot water. To lighten it to an appropriate level. And then he said that they got 2 lumps of sugar per person. Now they used sugar cubes. I do not have sugar cubes, and I forgot to make some last night. So I'll use a little sugar. Apparently his mother liked lemon. And he said that in cafes, the tea was often a little weaker. On the trains, it was often stronger. Oddly enough, there was no tea served when he took a plane during Soviet times. But everywhere you went, pretty much, there was tea. I've done a full tasting notes for this Georgian tea. This is the black premium tea from Georgian Tea Limited. And I've done full tasting notes in the past on my blog, and I'll link to those below. It's interesting how I find that this Georgian tea doesn't get really, really bitter and unpleasant. It doesn't have the level of tannin that I sometimes find in Indian teas or Sri Lankan teas, which is what they would use when there were shortages of Georgian tea in the late 80s. And it's interesting because I feel like this tea almost has a bit of a citrusy, lemony note just to the taste of the tea itself. So that would go really nicely with lemon. Now, traditionally, a lot of Turkish tea glasses don't have the handle, so you would have to hold them very carefully from the top of the glass and sip. And it's an exercise in patience and not burning your fingers. Mine have a handle. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that despite being a fairly young child at the time, my friend still picked up on things. So he said his family had a summer house in the village, and his father just perpetually spent his life working on the house, and they had a live-in contractor. And this live-in contractor had been in prison. And in Russia, one of the things that I'd heard about, mostly on Reddit, I didn't know how much to trust it, was the practice of brewing something called shafir, which is a very, 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 very strong tea. It's so strong it can almost cause like a drug-like state. And they drank this instead of alcohol, which was banned. And their contractor had a taste for shafir, so that's what he would brew. And one of his kind of requirements as a worker was that he had to have a large amount of loose leaf tea, to the point where one summer, after they'd left him at the house to work by himself for several months, they came back and there was just a mound of wet tea leaves in the back of the house from where he discarded the tea that he'd used. So it was interesting to actually hear a first-hand account of that practice that kind of sounded like an oddity that people talked about. The other thing that was really funny was when shortages began, the Georgian tea farms came out with compressed tea. And while this is something that is done with very good quality teas these days, and was done with very good quality teas in China back in the late 20th century as well, and way back in history, in the Georgian tea farms, the perception among Russians was that this was much lower quality tea. So my friend said, even though there were tea shortages and their choices were compressed Georgian tea or getting cheap Indian or Sri Lankan tea, his parents would never buy the compressed tea because they thought it was just a much lower quality product. So it's just very interesting reminiscences and kind of primary experiences of this tea culture in a country that I've been fascinated with since I was a teenager, and that kind of shows this spread of tea culture around the world. So I hope you enjoyed this recent historical tea video. This was tea from Soviet Russia. If you want to see more of what I do, be sure to subscribe and hit a notification bell so you can see when I upload videos. I tend to upload every Sunday, but sometimes life gets in the way. Thank you for joining me for this tea session, and I hope I see you again sometime. Bye.